So welcome again to everybody to our May session of Business Wise Insiders. As usual, I'm going to take the liberty of putting everybody on mute just to minimize disruptions while I walk through today's presentation. The presentation itself will last about 20 or 25 minutes, after which we'll have a breakout discussion where you'll get a chance to introduce yourself, ask questions, share your own insights on today's topic with some of our wise guys, as well as our other attendees. You can also always ask questions in the chat window during the presentation, and if we can't get to it in real time, we'll be sure to touch on it in the discussion afterward. And I would encourage everybody to stick around for that part. That's really a key piece of Insiders, the interaction and idea exchange that occurs after the presentation, because it really sort of develops the topic further and gains perspective from the most important people, who are the sales reps putting these practices into action. So today we're going to revisit the status of cold calling in the current B2B environment. This is something we like to do at least once a year, taking a closer look at cold call strategies that sales reps can use to engage prospects and set first-time appointments over the phone. And specifically, we're going to take a look at a series of scripts that you can use to navigate the various phases of your cold calls and successfully start conversations and set appointments. But first, I want to take a minute to look at why, in the world of automated email prospecting sequences and AI and social media, why sales reps should still pick up the phone and dial hundreds of strangers with the goal of setting maybe a couple of appointments if you're lucky. I'm sure almost everyone here has heard or read something about how cold calling is dead, or that it doesn't work, or that it only works when you use it in a very specific way by warming up a prospect using other methods. And in that environment, you can't blame sales reps for asking questions like, is cold calling even worth my time? It takes a lot of time and energy. Do the results justify the investment of that time and energy? Will prospects still take my calls these days? Everyone screens their calls with caller ID. Nobody picks up, so why bother? Aren't other sales channels better and easier? You can use email and social media and networking and referrals, and they all seem to deliver a bigger bang for the buck. So why not just use those? And then finally, sort of summing up all these questions, does cold calling really still work? Or is it an outdated approach to B2B biz dev now here in 2024? But instead of searching for reasons not to cold call, let's take a look at some very good reasons that you should continue cold calling. And the first is that cold calling is direct. So simply put, cold calling offers the shortest potential path to a conversation with your prospect. And that alone makes it worth the effort. With email and social selling, you have to wait for a reply. With cold calling, you have a prospect on the phone. You can ask questions in real time, and you don't have to wait for them to get back to you. Cold calling is also far more human than any other prospecting channel, and that's something that's increasingly rare in today's sales landscape, and therefore, by definition, has value. And it allows sales reps to play to one of their biggest strengths, which is your own interpersonal skills. And that brings us to the third point, which I think is really important. Cold calling builds confidence and combats fear in a way that emailing and social selling does not. Successful sales, any way you slice it, requires human interactions, often uncomfortable ones. And if you limit yourself to the comfort of asynchronous prospecting methods like email and social media, you'll never build the confidence you need to offer honest advice to your prospects or clients, to tell them things that they need to hear, but may not want to. And then fourth, and most importantly, just like every other prospecting technique, it is true that cold calling is destined to fail if you're doing it the wrong way, or if you don't do it at all. But if you do it right, it can work just as well or better than other methods, especially in certain situations. And the stats really back it up. Sales cadences that use cold calling generate more appointments than the ones that don't. And sales cadences in general generate more appointments than people who are just sort of calling or emailing randomly. So it's a proven, established fact that cold calling as part of an effective cadence and as part of an overall B2B sales strategy is effective at generating more appointments. And this next slide, I want to back up a little bit and sort of reinforce a point I just made, which is that cold calling is a piece of a larger puzzle. previous Insiders attendees have heard us talk a lot about the 40-40-20 rule. We talk about it in relation to all aspects of sales and lead generation, and it helps us stay focused on this big picture that I just mentioned. And it's the idea that the vast majority of lead gen success comes from two basic concepts. First, your list, and second, your offer. And what we'll be talking about today, your cold call scripts, they sort of live on the right side of this slide, the 20% that covers what you say and how you say it. We'll be talking about that today. But as we do, please keep in mind that your cold call scripts are only one piece of a larger puzzle that involves a lot of other really important concepts, starting with that focused list of prospects who might benefit from what you offer, and then that offer that offers this compelling value to your prospect to give them a reason to act. Okay, so just to close out our introductory section, what does all of this mean when it comes to cold call scripts? What is the right way to cold call? Well, let's start by looking at what we're really doing when we're cold calling and what we're trying to accomplish. So first, when we cold call, we're calling a stranger and we're probably interrupting them. Second, we're engaging in a two-way conversation with that person that could go in any number of directions. No cold call is exactly like any other cold call. And then finally, we're looking to create a path to a longer, more in-depth conversation about problems, priorities, ideas, and solutions. And all of that is happening in the space of maybe a few minutes tops. So the best cold call scripts aren't going to be long and rigid and something you read to every prospect you get on the phone. They're going to be flexible and situational, and they're going to prepare you to react to whatever comes up in the cold call, whatever brush off, objection, or question that the prospect throws at you. They're going to need to be confident and conversational, because even the best scripts will deliver mediocre results without frequent practice. And then they're going to need to be consistent with your style and personality, which are critical to your individual approach to building rapport. So as we examine the various scripts in today's presentation, try to keep these principles in mind. I know this is a lot, but ultimately your goal is not to be spoon-fed a cold call script that someone else says is the best script ever, but instead to find the scripts that best equip you to be a confident and successful phone prospector. So before we look at the scripts, Deborah, did you want to offer anything by way of introduction?
Something that occurred to me, Sam, is when you were talking about the 40-40-20 rule, we know how important it is to target your market correctly and really find your dream clients to be prospecting to in the area of the list. And of course, the offer has to do with the reason that you should meet, not the reason that your prospect should buy or be interested in your in your products and services. And of course, what you're talking about today has to do with that final 20% that includes scripting. What occurred to me is that what's most important is in any rule is to actually follow the rule. So if you don't do the process, none of these rules matter. So
Right.
even if it isn't perfect, pick up the phone.
Right. And I think that's one of the big drags on the reputation of cold calling is people aren't using it as piece of this larger process that we know to be effective and where we know all the pieces are, important in their own way, some more than others. Because if you just cold call, like I said, and it's not based on this strong foundation, then it won't work and it'll justify your impression of cold calling as a failed tool and create this sort of vicious cycle. But we're here to break that. So let's turn to the scripts. So our first script, we're going to start with voicemail. We call this the voicemail email combo. And the fact that we're starting here is probably a good indicator of how cold calling has changed in recent months and years. You can really no longer think about cold calling without also thinking about how to reach your prospects when they don't answer your phone. That's one of the advantages and challenges of a landscape where the buyer-seller interaction is mostly remote. There are more than one way to reach your prospect, and you can use those various methods to complement one another. And since it's long been a fact that the vast majority of cold calls, 80% or more, go to voicemail, it's critical to have a voicemail strategy that includes a well-rehearsed message and a plan for follow-up. So here's just one example of a short and sweet voice message that you can leave. The important things to keep in mind here are that to contradict what I just said about cold calling when you get a prospect on the phone, in this case, you really should have a rigid script. Voicemail is the one area where there's no excuse not to nail it every time. since you're just reciting words into the phone. And just to note here that if you have a voicemail script that you like to use and you're comfortable sharing it, please do so in the breakout room at the end of the presentation. Great to hear that. And then secondly, use your voicemail to set up your next move. So the first is have a rigid script, and then think about that script as a way to set up another move. So in this case, a follow-up email to your prospect with additional information. So as you can see, this voicemail message does not include a phone number. That's because the odds that your prospect will call you back are very slim. So we've chosen to focus our energy on setting up that next step. I'm not going to read through the script, but you can sort of see the principle here. Short and sweet voicemail that leads to an email referring back to that voicemail. And this is a great example of using two different tools to amplify each other. So here's another example of that same tactic where the sales rep explicitly states that there's no need for a return phone call. So you're almost taking that off the table. And he mentions the subject line of the email he's about to send. So the goal here is the same. The tactic is essentially the same, but he's using a slightly different approach. He's using voicemail to warm up an email and specifically tying the two things, really trying to use that in sort of mutual reference to create the amplification effect. And then, of course, not every voicemail has to be about setting up an email follow-up. You can also go for the callback. But in order to succeed on that front, you're going to need to be crystal clear about the value your prospect will receive in return for replying and engaging. So here we have an example where, in this case, it would be Deborah. This is Deborah Klein with BusinessWise. I'm calling to schedule an executive briefing on trends in B2B business development over the next 12 to 18 months that include ideas and questions you can take back to your team. I'll try you again later this week, and you can always reach me at phone number. And a couple points specific to this approach. Here, it's better to tell your prospect that you'll call them back rather than waiting for them to call you. It's not their job to return your call, so you shouldn't ask for it. However, if you give them a good reason to call, they might do it. So be sure to include your phone number. And then finally, and this is probably obvious, if you say you'll call back, do it. And even though that might seem obvious, I think execution on a process is often what separates successful cold callers, successful sales reps from people who don't execute. So just keep in mind that do what you say, and that will deliver results in the end. So as far as why these strategies work, the first point to make is that a voice message that is clear, concise, direct is more likely to resonate with your prospect. They're more likely to listen, to understand what you're saying, to remember it, and therefore to respond. Secondly, whenever you offer something of value, it gives your prospect a reason to engage, even if it never goes any further, which is all you're asking them to do at this point anyway. You're aiming for a conversation, not a sale. And then finally, following up on your voicemail with an email and another callback uses multiple channels, touches to amplify your message, which only increases the odds that your message will be heard. Deb, did you have anything on voicemail?
This is a very old-fashioned rule, but one I think still has validity and importance. And that is when you're on the phone, whether you're actually talking to someone or you're just leaving a message, smile. It shows through your voice and makes a difference in how people connect with you.
Super key point. When I was researching role playing for a different presentation last year, I came across that tip and I thought it was just great. It's something you don't think about. You think about practicing the words rather than the tone. And just smiling, I think, can go a long way toward conveying the right type of tone that you want. Okay, so let's get into some scripts that you can use when you actually get a prospect on the phone. So your first mission is to get past that hello, to avoid getting shut down within the first 30 seconds. So this is a script that we've used at BusinessWise for a number of years. We call it the double handshake because it's sort of this two-pronged introduction. The first prong at the top, hello, I'm Deborah Klein. We haven't met, but do you have a moment to speak with me? Is to establish that you don't know this person. They don't know you, you haven't met. And then to ask permission to continue speaking. So if you get a yes at this stage, that's all you need. You can dive right into the call. But if your prospect says, no, I don't have time, then you can move on to the second prong, which is to ask if there's a better time today for you to connect. And the reason for asking permission, and you guys have probably read about the sort of pros and cons of permission-based openings versus non-permission-based. We're a big believer in permission-based, and we believe in it because when your prospect opens the door to a conversation, it's much more likely to be congenial, to be on a level playing field. They're more likely to listen to what you say when they agree to having you talk to them. And then the reason for establishing that you haven't met is to remove any potential friction that might stand in the way of a conversation. You want your prospect to focus on and respond to what you're saying and not be distracted trying to remember whether they know you or your company. So if you say we haven't met, it takes that completely off the table and you have their undivided attention. And then lastly, the second prong of the double handshake, where you ask, is there another time today? That can help apply gentle pressure on your prospect and convey a sense of urgency. And it actually makes it a little harder for him or her to brush you off. Often your prospect will just agree to talk right now rather than trying to find a time later that day. But that's just one approach. It's one that we've used before. Not everybody is comfortable with that sort of we haven't met, do you have time to talk with me approach. So I wanted to give another example of a permission-based opener. This one is from Jason Bay of the sales coaching organization Outbound Squad. He starts from the premise that he's likely interrupting the prospect, so it's best to just be upfront about that fact. So he's explicit about that in his initial request. He says, hey, Jesse, it's Jason. I know I'm probably catching you in the middle of something, but do you have 30 seconds for me to tell you why I'm calling, and then you can tell me if you want to keep chatting. He's asking the prospect if he can tell them why he's calling and being clear that it's entirely up to them. It's a very direct approach and one that's probably pretty hard to say no to after you've answered your phone in the first place. I really like this approach, and we've had some good feedback from prospects and clients who've used it. So if you're looking for that sort of casual conversational way of getting quickly into the conversation, this is a great script to try. And since we're taking a look at different types of approaches, I wanted to include an example that goes against some of what I just said, just as food for thought. As I mentioned, our double handshake script intentionally leaves out mention of your company. We're trying to reduce friction, increase prospect focus. The idea is partly to get your prospect to ask questions, since once they do, they'll be more likely to listen to the answers, but that's not for everybody. So here's an alternative approach from one of our favorite sources of sales knowledge. This is Anthony Iannarino of the Sales Blog. And he thinks you should keep things short, 20 seconds max. This is your initial intro. Be professional and credible. So introduce yourself and your organization to sort of establish credibility. This is who I am. This is who we are. And this is the reason I'm calling. And then finally, he suggests personalizing. So we're using cold call scripts, but there should be places in your script to mention your prospective client and their business by name and situation. Sort of like, a real life merge tag where you're putting something about the prospect and their company and their situation into your cold call script to make it feel like you're speaking directly to their circumstances. And some prospects do chafe at the idea of being asked if they have time to speak when they have no information about what you are, who you are, what you want, which is why some reps avoid the permission-based opener altogether and jump right into the reason for call. I would encourage you to think about and even try both approaches to see what feels right for you and what works for you. And we're happy, obviously, to talk through any questions or different issues as you experiment with these different approaches to find the right one for you. Deborah, anything to add from you?
Well, I think the practicing part is always better if you're not practicing on your actual best prospects. So again, I know you'll talk about it later, but any kind of practice you're willing and able to do with your colleagues, be tough on each other and practice in that vein rather than on your best prospects if possible.
Exactly. I think I read something where we included a slide in a different presentation that professional sales reps don't waste their prospects' time by practicing on them. They do their preparation in advance, and when they're speaking with an actual prospect, they've already done their practice and put in the work. All right, so for our third script, we use the acronym TRICK, which stands for the reason I'm calling. And the idea behind TRICK is twofold. First, it helps you remember to be direct and get to the point, and to ensure that your call has a purpose that both you and your prospect are clear on. I think way too often sales reps think about cold calling as just, I'm cold calling, I'm going to use my skills to start a conversation, but they don't really know what the ultimate goal is, what the reason, what the value that they're offering to their prospects to give them a reason to act. Because from the second your prospect picks up the phone, the questions that are running through their head are, Who is this and what do they want? Why are they calling me? Why are they interrupting me? And it's imperative that you answer that question quickly and with something that gives your prospect a reason to want to keep the conversation going. So thinking about TRIC, the reason I'm calling, can really put you in the mindset of offering that reason, that value. And we would suggest brainstorming with your colleagues about the reason for your call. What is your goal? I think very often it is to set an appointment, certainly not to sell your product. You want to start a conversation that leads to a discussion about challenges, problems, priorities, where you can offer your insights. But maybe it's just to discover if there's a reason to connect. Maybe you're calling to qualify a prospect, or maybe you're calling just to make an offer of value. You're not asking for anything in return. But whatever it is, you should think about it, agree on it with your colleagues, because I think being on the same page about it, being clear about it in your mind is really critical. Because really at the cold call stage, you have to assume your prospect isn't close to thinking about buying anything. So you ask yourself, what do they get from a meeting with me, even if they don't buy something? Deb mentioned this earlier. Why should they give me their valuable time now, even if they never become a client later? And use that to craft a compelling reason for your call. And then one common goal is to get your prospect to ask you a clarifying question like, who are you with? Or what do you guys do? I just mentioned on the previous slide, because when they ask, they'll be more likely to listen to your answer. So you need to be ready with something that's clear, concise, and unique, and that speaks to your prospect's challenges and priorities. And I wanted to talk about that for just a quick second. So here's an example of some of our what we do statements at BusinessWise. We address concerns over the number of qualified leads in your pipeline. We clear up confusion about how to gain first-time appointments with local decision makers. We reduce frustration over how to capture missed opportunities and lost revenue. In each of these examples, we start with a pain word: concern, confusion, frustration, and we focus on the prospect's problems and challenges. And then, of course, the other key after each of these pain points is that the prospect must also be open to change and improvement. So emphasizing that fact can put pressure on your prospect to decide between improvement and progress and growth on one hand, and the status quo on the other. And then once again, here's an alternative from Jason Bay as a way to avoid talking about features and benefits. When a prospect asks, what do you guys do? Jason encourages this who, what, how approach, where he talks about what you do through the lens of somebody that you've helped. So rather than just saying, oh, this is what we do, he says, great question. A VP of sales I work with at a company called ABC Company was in a situation where they had a problem and they wanted to achieve a goal. They used my help to achieve a solution. And then I'm curious, what are you doing to address that same problem? And with this approach, it's critical to end with this question to move the conversation forward. But it's a really smart way of answering the question in a way that I think the prospect can empathize with. They can put themselves in the shoes of this other person who Jason helped solve a problem. And then just one point, the question here at the end doesn't have to be, what are you doing to address that problem? It could even be something like, if that's on your radar, can we get 30 minutes on your calendar to look at how that approach might look for you guys? So if you're really geared towards selling that appointment, you can frame it in that way. Again, identify your objectives and modify the script accordingly. This is all food for thought. Deb, any thoughts from you?
Not right now, Sam.
Great, so let's keep going. So speaking of questions that move the conversation forward, we lump our next set of scripts into the category of let me ask you something, because questions are really critical. No matter what you say is the reason for your call, and no matter how good your what we do statement might be, your prospect is still likely to resist. It's an uncomfortable fact, but it is a fact. And the key to driving the conversation forward is by using these pointed questions. And this is really where the best, most practiced cold callers set themselves apart. This set of scripts and questions really gets at the idea of how successful sales reps deliver value, convey value that gives their prospects a reason to do anything, to take your call, set the appointment, take the next step, buy your product. Because prospects often resist not because they don't need your product, but because they aren't looking at problems and priorities in the right ways. And the right questions can open their eyes to a new perspective. The right questions can show them insights. It's a question, but it also contains value and information that makes them think about their problems and priorities in new ways. So here are a bunch of different ways you can address that issue. Each of these is in response to a slightly different question. So for example, if somebody says, oh, I don't have that problem, you can use this first question. Well, if X isn't a problem right now, I bet you're facing this other problem. Can I show you why that matters? Or if they say, oh, we're happy with how things are going, you can use the next question. Well, that probably means you're doing a good job at X, is that right? And down the list, you can see we're trying to convey value in the form of a question. Your competitors have adapted in these ways. Have you thought about that? Are you going to keep that same approach over the next 12 to 18 months when these three things will likely happen? Here are 5 problem areas I'm seeing in your industry. Which one of these could you take off your plate if you could? And then finally, you can always ask a clarifying question, basically saying, oh, if everything's going great, does that mean you're not looking to accomplish X, Y, or Z? And that can really drill down, sort of put pressure on your prospect to say yes or no, this is an issue, a problem for me, something that I want to address, something I'm open to discussing or not. And so the key tips here are, you know your prospect is going to object, you know how they will object, so prepare, be ready with the right question. Second, when your prospect resists, the cold call is in a bad spot, and you want to move it to a good spot, you need to move the conversation forward. And questions are the way to do that, because they elicit responses, which lead to more questions, and so on. And when your prospect talks and answers a question, that gives you more information that you can use to ask another question and drive the conversation forward in a way that still, like the last slide, conveys the insights, expertise, knowledge that you have that can help your prospect change their perspective. Deb, anything from you?
Like most things, there's a rhythm to this process. And one of the biggest challenges is how infrequent you get to have these conversations. So again, I'm going to keep harping on the value of practice. And I know when you're a seasoned salesperson, this kind of practice seems very mundane and something that could be a waste of time. I am such a believer that even the best athletes or musicians continue their practice, and we as salespeople should do the same.
Exactly. I mean, this is a lot of information. I get it, and I'm moving through it quickly because I want to get into the discussion. And just to respond to the question in the chat, we're going to send the presentation and the recording to everybody so you can move through it at your own pace and review it. But this is not a skill that comes naturally. I mean, some people are better at it than others, but it takes tons of practice. I mean, asking a question in the moment that also conveys insight and moves the conversation forward to a specific goal that you've identified beforehand, that's a difficult process. And it really is something that, like anything else, you can only get better at through practice. All right, so finally, I just wanted to offer a few last resort scripts for when your cold call is sort of on the verge of fizzling out. And the first one is one that we call the 369 question. This is from Sandler Training. I will say at the outset that this isn't for everybody, but it is a good illustration of a principle that you can use to rescue a conversation, pivot to follow-up. And the idea here is to let your prospect define the time frame for follow-up. So in this example, you say, okay, I understand you don't want to meet right now, so let me ask you 3, 6, or 9. Your prospect will say, what do you mean? And you say, when should I follow up? In 3, 6, or 9? And it's sort of a cheeky way to get the prospect to focus on whether you should follow up and on what time frame. And the key really is to have them define what that interval is. So instead of saying, oh, should I follow up in 3, 6, or 9 months? Let them say 3 days, 6 weeks. You know, you might get an answer that's shorter than the time frame that you initially anticipate. And then here's a more direct way of asking that exact same question. So apparently I can't help you at the moment. Since things can change quickly, I'd like to stay in touch, but I don't want to bother you. When do you suggest I connect with you again? This is just sort of a more conversational way of getting the prospect to acknowledge whether they would like a follow-up and then to define the time frame on which you can do that. And again, think about this more as a principle. You're going to reach this point in many cold calls where it looks like the prospect just doesn't want to move forward. But you should have strategies for doing these 3 things. Keep that flame alive. One last chance to give direction and purpose to the conversation and make that plan for follow-up. If your prospect does agree to a follow-up and provides a time frame, that gives you a chance to ask the question, well, what might change between now and then? And that might then spark that conversation that leads to the appointment that seemed elusive. And then finally, I've already said it, but let your prospect define the time frame, because it may be sooner than you think. And then also that represents their buy-in to the follow-up. So it's not you bothering them, it's you following through on what they've asked you to do. Deborah, any remarks in conclusion?
For those of you that are familiar with the disc styles, remember that successful salespeople have a variety of behavior styles, as do our prospects. So there are some folks that would connect on an elevator on between the first floor and the fifth, and other people where connections take a much longer time. So don't get frustrated with the fact that this is difficult, that it doesn't happen easily all the time, and yet sometimes it does. So the real key is to try and take some of these wonderful ideas that Sam has shared, keep practicing, keep improving, because it does work. Unfortunately, not all the time.
And if it ever doesn't work, please tell us, because we want to help walk you through how to improve. Like I said, these scripts are detailed. If you don't do them the right way, maybe it doesn't get the result you want. It takes a lot of moving pieces syncing up in the right way, but we're here to help as a resource to prospects and clients, so please let us know. Thank you for sitting through the presentation as I walked through some of these ideas. And again, I encourage you to stick around for the breakout session. So let's switch over to that. Thanks again, everybody.